Jupiter is known as a planet of luck, expansion, and abundance. And yes, Jupiter does bring all of that. But there's the layer of Jupiter that almost no one talks about. And it's the layer that actually determines whether those blessings land. Because Jupiter doesn't just expand what you have, Jupiter expands what you believe. And that distinction changes everything. So let me place Jupiter inside a larger framework before we go sign by sign, because without this context, Jupiter becomes just another lucky planet, and that would be selling it short. In my inner cosmology, the planets aren't just external forces influencing your life from the outside. They're mirrors. They reflect something already happening inside you. The inner planets, Sun, Mercury, the Moon, Venus, they show the personal psychology, how you perceive, how you feel, what you want, what you fear, and what you believe you deserve. But when we move beyond the Earth's orbit, this is where the inner planets begin to express itself outwardly. And Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn are the external representations of that. So Mars is where the inner pattern becomes action, and Jupiter is where the action is given belief, meaning, and justification. And Saturn is where the belief becomes reality. So Jupiter sits in the middle of that sequence, and that tells you exactly what Jupiter is doing. Jupiter is not really the planet of luck in the way that we think, because Jupiter is really the planet of belief. Jupiter is where you say, this is true, and this is what I believe, and this is what I deserve, and this is what I'm reaching for, and here's why. In its highest expression, Jupiter does give wisdom, faith, luck, genuine truth, the higher perspective of life. It is the part of you that can step back, zoom out, and see the broader meaning in what you're experiencing. But here's why shadow work is essential, because Jupiter, in its lower expression, doesn't give you wisdom. It gives you justification. It takes whatever action Mars just took from the wound, which is the reaction, the defense, the chase, the competition, the avoidance, and it wraps it in a story that makes it feel righteous. It feels moral. It feels spiritually necessary, maybe even enlightened. This is how unconscious patterns survive for years without being questioned. Mars acts from the wound, and then Jupiter steps in and says, yes, I have a good reason. So the wound gets a belief system built around it. And once the wound has a belief system, it becomes very difficult to see because now it feels like truth. You are completely identified with it. You feel like it is who you are, what you stand for, what you deserve, or it is what the world is like. And this is why in shadow work, like all the other planets, Jupiter is important to examine. Not because it's negative. Jupiter is genuinely one of the greatest forces of growth in the chart, but because wherever Jupiter is placed, this is where your beliefs are most active and beliefs shape everything. So when you have a Jupiter by sign in the natal chart, we're asking two questions at the same time. The first question is the obvious one. Where does this person find meaning, inspiration, and expansion? But the second question is the deeper one. Where does this person's belief system most need to be examined? Because Jupiter expands whatever it touches. Because if what it's touching is wisdom and genuine perspective, it expands that. But if it's touching a wound that's been given a justification, it also expands that too. And this is why two people with strong Jupiter placements can have completely different lives. One person's Jupiter can bring genuine growth and meaning, and the other person's Jupiter can keep expanding the story that protects the wound. And usually you can see this in the chart based on the aspects it's making. But the difference between those two Jupiters and how they're expressed is really consciousness. So in this video, I'm going through Jupiter in each sign, not just to tell you where your luck lives, but to show you where your belief system is most active and what shadow work looks like when you bring Jupiter's energy inward instead of projecting it outward. Because when Jupiter becomes conscious, it doesn't just expand your life, it expands your awareness. And that is what it was always meant to do. So, welcome to Starwell Astrology. My name is Shari. I am a Western tropical astrologer with a very special focus on shadow work, esoterics, and astrotheology. If this resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe, like, hype, share. It all helps my channel to grow. As well as don't forget that I do offer a free weekly shadow work circle every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern, which is 4 p.m. Pacific. Feel free to join me. Just go to my website at starwellastro.com. So before we can understand Jupiter, we have to understand how belief is actually formed. Because Jupiter rules belief, faith, wisdom, meaning, and the way we understand life from a larger perspective. But most of our beliefs do not begin in the higher mind. They begin in the body. They begin in the emotional field. They begin with the moon. And the moon represents emotional memory, instinct, unconscious patterns, early conditioning, and what made us feel safe or unsafe. So before we believe something consciously, the moon has already created an emotional atmosphere around what feels familiar, what feels threatening, what feels like home. And so this is why many of the beliefs we carry are not really chosen. They're inherited, they're conditioned, they are formed from emotional memory, childhood experiences, family patterns, and the emotional environment we have adapted in order to survive. So the moon determines what safety feels like. And then Mercury comes in and begins to interpret the emotional atmosphere of the moon. So Mercury is the mind, it's the nervous system, it's perception, it's language, it's meaning making. Mercury takes what the moon feels and build a story around it that we feel completely identified with. And this begins to create our personality or begins to shape our personality. So if the moon carries an emotional memory of rejection, then Mercury begins to interpret life through the expectation of being rejected. If the moon carries a wound around worth, then Mercury begins to translate every experience through that lens. This is how perception is formed. The nervous system receives the emotional imprint, and Mercury gives it language, logic, interpretation, meaning. So, what we call perception is often not neutral. It is the mind reading reality through the emotional atmosphere of the moon. But here is a critical thing. Mercury doesn't always know it's working from a wound. Mercury thinks it's just being accurate because Mercury thinks it's simply describing reality as it is, but it is really describing reality as the moon has filtered it. Then Venus comes in, and Venus shows what we value, what we deserve, what we feel worthy of receiving. But Venus is not forming values in isolation. She's forming values based on what the moon has been conditioned to feel and what Mercury has been conditioned to perceive. So, the moon carries a wound. Mercury creates a perception from the wound, and then Venus begins to value whatever feels safest, whatever feels most likely to secure love, approval, comfort, or belonging. And now we're not just thinking something, we're beginning to believe it. And this is what creates the persona or the conditioned personality, or what I call the ego identity. The identity is shaped, it's not just from a thought. It is from a felt reality in the body, in what we allow ourselves to want, in what feels possible, and what never even occurred to us to reach for. Then Jupiter arrives, and Jupiter asks, what do I believe is possible for me? And what do I believe I'm worthy of? And what do I believe life will give me? Jupiter expands the belief system. But here is when shadow work becomes essential because the belief system is built on an unconscious moon wound and a distorted Mercury perception and a Venus value system shaped by survival. And then Jupiter doesn't just expand truth, Jupiter expands the wound. It expands the story, it expands the compensation, it expands the desire to prove worth or the need for more, because underneath a person doesn't yet feel safe, loved, valued, or enough. So this is why Jupiter is not only the planet of blessings, Jupiter is also the planet that reveals what we truly believe. Not what you think you believe, but what you actually believe. Because what you truly believe shows up in what we keep reaching for, what we keep expecting, what we keep justifying, what we keep expanding. So, in its highest expression, Jupiter brings genuine wisdom, faith, and a broader perspective of life. It is part of you that can step back and see the deeper meaning in what you're experiencing. But in its lower expression, working from an unexamined wound, Jupiter justifies the belief. It makes the wound feel righteous, moral, or more spiritually necessary. But a wound with a belief built around it is very difficult to see because it no longer feels like a wound. It feels like truth. So then Mars carries that belief into action. Mars acts from the desire, the trigger, the impulse, the wound. And so if Jupiter believes that worth must be proven, Mars acts through striving, pushing, competing, or overextending. And if Jupiter believes love is scarce, then Mars chases or defends. So Mars does not just stop to question whether the belief is true. Mars just takes action from it. And then Saturn crystallizes the result. Saturn gives form to what has been repeated over time. And Saturn turns the belief, the perception, the value, and the action you've taken into lived reality. So, what the moon felt and what Mercury interpreted, and then Venus valued, Jupiter expands and Mars acts on. Then Saturn turns it into the life we're living. And this is why shadow work matters at every point in that sequence. Because if we really try to change the outer reality without examining the belief system beneath it, we keep repeating the same pattern in a different form. But when we witness the moon wound, question Mercury's perception, and refine what Venus believes she is worthy of, and then bring Jupiter into conscious awareness, we begin to shift our perception on reality in a real way where we begin to align with our true and authentic self, which is our sun sign. So our perception shifts and broadens, and we're able to see other possibilities that were not available before. Now, as we slowly take action on a broader perception that gives us more possibilities, our reality changes. And this is when Saturn gives form to a new reality. Jupiter is the higher mind that helps us to see the belief system we're living inside. And when Jupiter becomes conscious, it doesn't just simply give us more, it helps us understand why we wanted more in the first place. Let's begin with Jupiter in Aries. Jupiter in Aries is one of the most energized placements for Jupiter. And that makes sense because Jupiter in Aries connects through fire. And fire energy is a very active energy. So Jupiter is already expansive, future-oriented, and driven towards growth and meaning. And Aries brings passion and instinct and courage and the impulse to act. And so when Jupiter and Aries are together, when Jupiter is in Aries, these qualities don't just coexist, they amplify each other. And this is not a patient Jupiter. This is not a Jupiter that wants to wait for the right moment and to gather every detail or to map out every step before beginning. Jupiter in Aries believes life opens through action. So there is this inner sense that if you're bold enough to begin, the path will appear, and that if you trust your impulse, something will respond. And that can be a genuine gift for this placement. There's often a natural confidence there, a willingness to go first, a willingness to try before everything is fully figured out. So this makes them extremely courageous. This person may not need a lot of external reassurance before beginning because the belief itself, the faith is in the impulse to move. It's already there. And because Jupiter rules beliefs, this becomes a core part of how they understand life. They believe courage is rewarding and an action creates opportunity, and that boldness is how things get started. So, this placement can produce real pioneers, people who don't need to don't need a pre-existing path. They will make a path. They're willing to make one on their own and on their own terms. They may step into leadership positions, entrepreneurship, activism, or any pursuit that requires someone to step out ahead of the crowd and say, I'll go first. So there's always a strong connection to truth here because Aries is ruled by Mars and the placement of action, assertion, and the warrior. And Jupiter rules belief and higher meaning. Together, they create someone who doesn't just believe something quietly, they stand for it, they will fight for it. Causes connected to freedom, independence, justice often resonate deeply with this placement. There's something in them that genuinely cannot stay silent when something feels wrong or unjust. And that is the gift. But now let's talk about the shadow because Jupiter expands what it touches. And in Aries, that cuts both ways because so Jupiter can expand courage, but it can also expand over impulsiveness. It can expand confidence, but it can also expand overconfidence. The kind that bypasses preparation and mistakes speed for readiness. So here's a specific tension towards what's possible, what's coming, where the vision is going. It's not usually interested in details, in small steps or methodical planning. And Aries doesn't slow down for those things either. Aries is a sign of initiation. It's the spark. It sparks the fire. It gets things moving, but it doesn't sustain the fire through the long-term goal. So, what we often see with Jupiter and Aries is a tremendous energy to begin something, but then there's a real challenge to follow through. Not because the person doesn't care, but because once the initial excitement passes, the fire loses its charge. And then something new comes along that sparks a new round of enthusiasm, and the cycle starts again. So, for short term goals, this placement can be very effective. Anything that requires courage, a bold first step, or the willingness to act before it is fully ready. Jupiter and Aries can do that. But long-term goals require something that displacement has to consciously develop. They need to develop patience and structure and the ability to keep moving even when the feeling of inspiration isn't there. And this is where Saturn becomes part of the story because Jupiter in Aries can expand the desire to act, but Saturn crystallizes what that action actually produces over time. And Saturn shows the consequences. So, whatever belief Jupiter in Aries is acting from, Saturn actually shows what the belief is building. This brings us to the inner sequence we talked about in the introduction, where the moon carries the emotional memory. But for Jupiter in Aries, if the moon learned early on that safety comes from being strong and from moving fast and from acting before someone else does, then the nervous system organizes itself around readiness, around being prepared to defend, to assert, or to go first. And then Mercury interprets reality through that atmosphere. So life begins to feel like something that must be responded to quickly, like hesitation is danger, or like waiting feels like losing. And then Venus begins to value strength and independence and self sufficiency because those things were what the body associated with safety and worth. And then Jupiter takes all of that and expands it into a belief system. The belief system might sound like I grow when I push through, or I'm worthy when I'm strong, or life rewards the bold, or I have to earn what I want through action. And then Mars, which is already the ruling planet of Aries, carries the belief into behavior urgently without stopping, without asking whether the belief is accurate or whether the moment actually calls for action or whether what looks like confidence is actually fair in motion. And this is the unconscious pattern of Jupiter in Aries. It's not that it's wrong, it's just an unseen pattern because sometimes what looks like bold action is actually avoidance, moving fast so you don't have to feel what's underneath, staying in motion so you don't have to sit with the discomfort of uncertainty, or fighting outward battles so you don't have to face the internal one. And the internal battle is always where the real work is. So in shadow work, the question for Jupiter in Aries is not, how do I channel my fire better? The question is, what am I believing that keeps turning my life into a battle? Because if Jupiter is the belief planet and Aries keeps experiencing life as something that is to be conquered or defended, and then somewhere in the belief system, there's a wound that life is adversarial, that you have to fight to be safe, and that strength is the only currency that matters, then that wound will keep organizing the action of Mars and therefore keep producing a Saturn reality that confirms the belief until the belief is witnessed. And this is what I mean when I say shadow work is not about becoming passive. For Jupiter in Aries, especially, I want to be clear. The fire is not the problem. The courage is not even the problem. Willingness to act on is not the problem. In fact, those qualities, when they become conscious, are this placement's greatest strength. The work is learning to pause long enough to ask, where is the impulse coming from? Am I acting from genuine alignment, from a truth I can see clearly, I can feel clearly, or from a direction that actually resonates with who I am? Or am I acting from a wound, from fear, dressed in boldness? That pause is not weakness. That pause is actually what Jupiter's higher mind has a chance to enter. Because the difference between impulsive action and courageous action is consciousness. Both move, but one moves from the wound and the other moves from truth. And Jupiter in Aries, when it matures into this distinction, becomes something genuinely powerful. Not just someone who acts first, but someone who acts with direction. Someone who fights, but for the right things. Someone whose courage comes not from having nothing to lose, but from having done the inner work and knowing exactly where they stand and what they stand for. This is why I think of this placement as the spiritual warrior archetype, because Jupiter and Aries have real access to it. But the spiritual warrior is not someone who has never been afraid. The spiritual warrior is someone who has faced themselves, who has had the courage to sit with the discomfort of their own shadow and not run from it. That's the initiation of Jupiter in Aries, not the external battle, the internal one. And here's what I've seen in doing this work. When Jupiter is in Aries and it turns the fire inward towards self-witnessing, towards honest examination of the belief driving the behavior, they tend to move through shadow work with a real determination, because Aries doesn't like to stay stuck. Once this person sees something that needs to be faced, they generally want to deal with it. They don't want to spend years in avoidance. There's an impatience with stagnation that can actually serve the healing process as long as it doesn't push past the feeling that needs to be felt. So the invitation for Jupiter in Aries is this: let the fire mature, not diminish, but mature. Let faith become more than enthusiasm. Let courage include the willingness to be still, and let action be something chosen, not just something that happens in response to urgency. Because when Jupiter in Aries gets there, when the belief system has been examined and refined and the fire has been tempered by self-awareness, what comes through is genuine. The action is aligned. The leadership is real. The courage is earned. And at that point, Jupiter in Aries doesn't just begin things for themselves. They inspire others to begin. They show people what it looks like to trust yourself enough to take the first step, to move towards life instead of waiting for permission, to believe that something is possible before it's proof. And that's the higher expression of this placement: faith that moves, courage that's conscious, action that serves something greater than the need to prove. And that is the blessing of Jupiter in Aries. Jupiter in Taurus. Jupiter in Taurus is a very different energy from Jupiter in Aries. Jupiter in Aries expands through action. It believes life opens when you move and when you begin and when you have the courage to go first. But Jupiter in Taurus expands through grounding. It believes life opens when something is built, slowly, consistently, and with real value behind it. And this distinction matters because it tells us something important about what this person believes growth actually requires. So Jupiter is the planet of expansion, faith, wisdom, and belief. And Taurus is in an earth sign ruled by Venus, and it's connected to the body, the senses, resources, self-worth, comfort, and the material world. So when Jupiter is in Taurus, that expansive Jupiter energy doesn't disappear, it gets rooted. So instead of leaping towards the future, Jupiter in Taurus wants to build something that can actually be sustained, something that they can feel and touch and return to. And that is one of the genuine gifts of this placement, because the understanding that abundance isn't always hidden. Sometimes blessings grow through patience, and sometimes faith isn't about taking a leap. Sometimes faith is about staying devoted to what is being built, even when the results are slow to arrive. So this person may not always move quickly, but once they believe in something, they stay with it. They show up consistently. They develop things over time until they become genuinely valuable. And that kind of endurance, the Taurus steadiness, can create real lasting abundance. There is also another strong neutral connection here to money, beauty, food, land, music, art, anything that engages the senses and creates a sense of peace. Because Taurus is ruled by Venus, growth and value are deeply linked to this placement. Part of how Jupiter in Taurus expands is by learning what it truly values and not what it has been told to value, and not what feels safe to want, but what is genuinely worth building a life around. But now let's talk about the shadow, because Jupiter expands whatever it touches. And in Taurus, that includes the Taurus tendency towards attachment. Taurus loves comfort. Jupiter loves more. So together they can create a desire for more comfort, more security, more money, more pleasure, more reassurance. And underneath all of that, a belief that says, when I have enough, I will finally feel safe. And that belief is where the shadow lives, because the material world is not the problem. The body is not the problem. Money is not the problem. Pleasure is not the problem. These things are part of life, and Taurus understands their value better than almost any other sign. The shadow begins when the outer world is used to manage what is unresolved in the inner world, when comfort becomes a substitute for emotional truth, when accumulation becomes a way to avoid the deeper question of worth. So let's bring in the inner sequence here, because Jupiter in Taurus, this is especially important. The moon holds the emotional memory. And if the moon learned early that safety comes from consistency and from having enough, or from things staying predictable, then the nervous system organizes itself around security and becomes alert when there's any sign of threat. And it reaches for more, not always from abundance, but from fear. And Mercury then interprets reality through that atmosphere. Change starts to feel threatening, uncertainty starts to feel unsafe, and the mind begins to frame stability not as a value, but as a survival requirement. So Venus comes in, and because Taurus is ruled by Venus, this part matters more for Jupiter in Taurus than for most other placements, because Venus rules the value system, what we desire, what we feel worthy of receiving, what we think will make us feel loved and safe and whole. But if Venus is shaped by a moon wound and Mercury perception is rooted in scarcity, then Venus may begin to value security over truth, familiarity over growth, holding on over trusting life. And when Jupiter expands, that belief may sound like growth means accumulation. Worth is measured by what I have. If I can hold on to what I've built, I'm safe. Or if I lose it, something is wrong with me. So then Mars carries that belief into behavior, working harder, requiring more, resisting change, defending what has been built, not from fear, but from what has been built underneath the strength. And Saturn crystallizes the results over time, a life that looks stable from the outside, but inside, there's still a hunger that more hasn't filled, and still an anxiety that security hasn't resolved. And there's still a question of worth that material accumulation keeps circling, but never fully answers. And this is the pattern that Jupiter in Taurus has to see. There's nothing wrong with stability. Stability is one of Taurus's genuine gifts. But because there is a difference between being grounded and being attached, groundedness says, I am rooted in myself. Attachment says, I cannot feel safe unless this stays the same. And one creates peace while the other creates a quiet, persistent fear of loss. So, in shadow work, the question for Jupiter and Taurus is not how do I attract more abundance? The question is, what am I reaching for when I feel emotionally unsettled? Am I building because something is genuinely valuable or because I'm afraid of not having enough? Am I holding on because this is aligned or because change feels like a threat? Because the body holds these answers for Taurus more than the mind does. Taurus is a somatic sign. It lives in sensation, in physical experiences, in what the body registers as safe or unsafe. And much of the emotional truth that Jupiter in Taurus needs to access is stored exactly there, in the places where the body tightens, holds, braces, and reaches. So shadow work for this placement often begins in the body, not in analysis, in presence, in learning to sit with physical discomfort long enough to hear what it's actually saying rather than reaching for something to make it go away. And this is where the real healing is for Jupiter in Taurus, not in having more, but in learning to receive what is already there. Not abundance, not accumulation, but abundance as presence, the capacity to feel safe in the body without needing the external world to guarantee that safety first. And when Jupiter in Taurus gets there, when the belief system shifts from I need more to feel safe to I'm rooted in something that cannot be taken, this placement becomes genuinely powerful because Taurus, in its highest expression, understands something most people don't, that real value takes time, and that what is built slowly, consistently, outlasts what is built quickly. That patience is not weakness, it's a form of faith, and that the person who knows how to stay, how to build, how to keep showing up without rushing the process is capable of creating something something that endures. At its highest, Jupiter in Taurus teaches that abundance is not just what you have, it is what you're able to receive. And that receiving begins with being present enough to recognize what is already here, from chasing more to actually inhabiting what has already been built. From using the material world to fill an inner emptiness to bringing consciousness to the material world so that what you create genuinely reflects what you value. And once that shift happens, Jupiter in Taurus doesn't just attract abundance, it begins to demonstrate it. It becomes a demonstration of it. Someone whose life reflects real worth, real value, real faith in the slow, steady process of building something that lasts. Let's go to Jupiter in Gemini. Jupiter in Gemini is one of the most complex placements to understand because there's a built-in tension here that most people don't talk about. Because Jupiter rules Sagittarius, and Sagittarius is the opposite of Gemini. And so when Jupiter is placed in Gemini, you have the higher mind trying to work through the lower mind, and those two don't always cooperate. But here's the distinction. Jupiter wants the big picture, wisdom, meaning the larger truth behind the experience. And Gemini wants to understand how things connect, the details, the information, the language, the movement of ideas. Jupiter asks, what does it all mean? And Gemini asks, What about this piece and this piece and this piece? So there's a real creative friction in this placement. And how the person navigates the friction determines whether Jupiter in Gemini becomes a gift or a shadow. The gift is real. This placement can produce someone who is genuinely curious and open, willing to consider different perspectives, able to hold nuances, and capable of connecting ideas that other people don't think to connect, because Gemini is ruled by Mercury and Jupiter expands whatever Mercury is doing. So Jupiter in Gemini can expand communication, expand perception, expand the desire to understand and share what has been understood. This can make someone a very effective teacher, writer, speaker, or guide, someone who takes complex ideas and make them accessible. Someone who can bridge the higher mind and the lower mind. This is actually what Mercury is designed to do in the first place. And here is where we have to go deeper, because Jupiter expands what it touches. And in Gemini, that includes Gemini tendency to keep moving. So Gemini is a sign of mental movement, from one thought to the next, one topic to the next, one idea to the next, what's interesting, what they're curious about, moving through as much information as possible. And Jupiter expand that movement onto the person is gathering enormous amounts of information without ever stopping long enough for any of it to land. And this is the core shadow of Jupiter in Gemini. It's subtle because it looks like growth and it looks like learning and it looks like spiritual seeking, but what can actually be in the mind stays in constant motion. So it never gets to be still enough to assimilate the information, because stillness requires feeling and feeling requires presence. And for Jupiter in Gemini, the mind can become very skilled at staying just above the emotional body, understanding things intellectually without integrating them emotionally. So Gemini is brilliant at naming things. It can observe a pattern, it can describe it accurately, it can analyze why it exists and explain it to everyone else. But there's a difference between being able to name a wound and actually healing it. And Jupiter in Gemini has to learn that distinction, the difference between exploration and embodiment. So let's bring in the inner sequence. So the moon holds the emotional memory. And if the moon learned that safety comes from being mentally alert and from being informed or being able to explain what is happening, or from being quick enough to adapt. The nervous system learned that the mind being active is what keeps the danger away. So then Mercury then interprets reality through that atmosphere. Life starts to feel like something that must be understood in order to be navigated safely. So the instinct becomes figure it out, name it, explain it, and find another angle. So Venus forms the value system from there, meaning intelligence becomes valuable. Being interesting, being informed, being able to keep the conversation moving, these things start to feel connected to worth and belonging. And then Jupiter expands the belief. The belief becomes growth. Growth comes from knowing more. The more I understand, the safer I am, the more I can explain, the more control I'm in. Then Mars acts from that belief, speaking quickly, asking many questions, researching, multitasking, moving from one thing to the next, always seeking the next piece of information that will finally make things clear. And then Saturn crystallizes the result over time, a life full of ideas and conversation and knowledge, but underneath a nervousness that never quite settles, a mind that is always moving but never arriving. So this is the pattern Jupiter in Gemini has to see. And the nervous system is the key here, because Gemini is connected to Mercury, which rules the nervous system. And Jupiter in Gemini can expand mental activity to the point where the nervous system becomes overstimulated. The mind wants more information, but the body needs quiet. The mind wants to keep searching, but the soul is asking for integration. So in shadow work, the question for Jupiter in Gemini are honest ones. Am I seeking information because I'm genuinely curious or because I'm anxious and information makes me feel less exposed? Am I asking questions because I want truth or because I don't trust what I already know? Am I talking about the wounds because I already understand them or because talking about it means I don't have to feel it? These are important questions, not harsh ones, just honest ones, because the mind is not the enemy here. The mind is the gift, but the mind has to learn to serve the soul instead of manage the experience. And this is where Jupiter in Gemini has to develop the willingness to say, I don't know yet. The willingness to stop talking long enough to feel. The willingness to let truth be larger than language. Because not everyone can understand through words, and not everything can be healed through explanation. So if you hear nothing else, hear this. And I happen to have this placement. Wisdom comes when the mind gets quiet enough to receive something that it wasn't looking for. That is where the answers come. It's not from your filing cabinet of information that you've gathered. So this is where Jupiter in Gemini becomes spiritually mature. When curiosity stops being a way to stay safe and to start being a genuine pursuit of truth, when communication stops being a way to manage distance and start being a vehicle for something real, and when the person stops collecting information and start digesting it. So this is where Jupiter in Gemini becomes spiritually mature. Maturity comes when communication stops being a way to manage distance and start being a vehicle for something real. And when the person stops collecting information and starts digesting it. Because there is a difference between gathering and integrating. The mind can gather indefinitely, but wisdom requires the soul to process what has been taken in. And that processing is much slower than Gemini naturally moves. It requires pausing, sitting with something, letting it move through the emotional body instead of just the mental one. So when Jupiter in Gemini learns to do that, when it learns to let information become understanding and understanding become embodied wisdom, this placement becomes genuinely powerful. Because at that point, this person is not just repeating what they've learned, they're translating it. They're taking higher truths and making them accessible to other people. They're connecting dots that others can't see, not because they have more information, but because they've integrated what they know. And this is the higher expression of displacement, the messenger of wisdom, not just a collector of facts, the teacher who communicates from lived understanding, not just from what has been read or studied. And that's the difference between Jupiter and Gemini in its lowest and its highest. At its lowest, scattered, overstimulated, mistaking information for truth, talking about the wound instead of healing it. At its highest, a clear channel for higher truth, someone who uses language not to perform intelligence, but to actually illuminate something, someone whose curiosity leads somewhere real. And the mind becomes wise when it stops collecting information to feel safe and starts using what it knows to reveal something true. And that is the wisdom path of Jupiter in Gemini. Jupiter in Cancer. Jupiter in Cancer is one of the strongest placements for Jupiter in the entire zodiac. And the reason why it tells something important about what Jupiter actually needs in order to work well. So Jupiter is exalted in Cancer, and that's because this is one of the signs where Jupiter can express its highest nature most fully. But it doesn't do that through ambition or achievement or external success. It does it through something far more internal. So in Cancer, Jupiter expands through the emotional body. Cancer rules the moon, connected to the emotional memory, the mother, family, ancestry, the home, inner child, as well as the felt sense of safety. And when Jupiter is placed here, the search for meaning becomes deeply personal. The person may not find growth primarily through philosophy or study or adventure. They find it through the heart, through family, through healing what was inherited, through understanding where they come from and what that has made them. And that is one of the genuine gifts of this placement. There's often a deep instinct to care, to nurture, to protect, to create emotional safety for the people they love. Jupiter in Cancer may grow through family, through emotional bonds, through caregiving, through ancestral healing, through building something that feels like home, not just physically, but emotionally, because Cancer remembers, and Jupiter expands what Cancer remembers. So this placement can carry a very large emotional field. Not only personal memory, but family memory, ancestry memory, the emotional inheritance of the line they come from, and the blessing and the burdens that has been passed down without words. And this is also why Jupiter in Cancer can be so powerful for healing. The wisdom here doesn't always come through the mind, it comes through intuition, through the body, through what is felt before it is understood. And because Jupiter is exalted here, there's often a natural capacity to receive support and blessings through emotional connections and through family and through creating safety for others. But Jupiter expands whatever it touches. And in Cancer, that includes the tendency to hold on. So Cancer wants to feel safe and Jupiter wants more. So together, this can create a deep hunger for more emotional security, more reassurance, more closeness, more belonging, more proof of being loved. And that hunger, when it stays unconscious, can drive the whole pattern. So the shadow is not that it cares too much. Caring is the gift. The shadow is when the caring becomes the strategy for safety. And when the person gives and gives not only from love, but from the belief that being needed is what makes them belong. And when they hold the family together, not only from devotion, but from a quiet terror of what happens if they stop. Also, when nurturing becomes a way to avoid feeling their own vulnerability. So let's bring in the sequence because Cancer is ruled by the moon, and this placement is where the moon's role in the entire chain is most visible. So the moon holds the emotional memory, and if the moon learned early that safety comes from being emotionally available and from keeping others close and from being the one who holds things together, then the nervous system organizes itself around connection. It becomes alert to any sign of emotional distance. It reads shifts in the room. It feels what others feel before they say it. Mercury interprets reality through that atmosphere. Distance starts to feel like rejection. Change starts to feel like abandonment. Independence in others or themselves can start to feel like a kind of loss. So Venus forms the value system here. But loyalty becomes deeply valuable. Being needed becomes connected to worth. Closeness and emotional reassurance starts to feel like the markers of love. And then Jupiter expands the belief. The belief might be I grow by protecting what I love. I am worthy when I am needed, or safety comes from keeping the people I love close, or if I hold everything together, nothing will fall apart. So Mars then acts from the belief, caretaking, defending, staying, vigilant, clinging to what is familiar, avoiding conflict that might create distance. And then Saturn crystallizes the result over time, a life that looks warm and connected from the outside, full of family, full of care, but internally carrying more than belongs to one person. The weight of the family's emotional history, the unspoken grief, the ancestral pattern that no one has named. This is the pattern Jupiter in Cancer has to see. because Jupiter in Cancer can absorb more than what belongs to them. They feel the emotion of the family without being able to separate what is theirs from what has been handed down. And they may carry grief that isn't only personal. They may take on responsibility for emotional dynamics that were already broken before they arrived. And that is a lot to carry, especially when you genuinely love the people you're carrying it for. So in shadow work, the question of Jupiter in Cancer is not, how do I stop caring? The question is, whose feelings am I actually holding right now? Is this mine or is this inherited? Am I nurturing from a genuine desire to give or from the fear that if I stop, I'll lose the connection? Am I honoring the past or am I living inside it? Those questions matter because Cancer can become so identified with family memory that it becomes difficult to know where the family ends and where the self begins. And part of the healing for this placement is learning to make that distinction, not to reject family, not to disconnect from the past, but to become conscious of what was unconscious, to see the pattern, to choose not to repeat it, to create a new emotional foundation within themselves. Because here's what I want to be clear about. Healing the ancestral line does not mean carrying everyone's emotions. That is an important distinction for Jupiter in Cancer. The work is not more carrying. The work is conscious witnessing, seeing what has been passed down, understanding where it came from, and deciding what you're willing to keep and what you're ready to release. So this is where the exaltation of Jupiter in Cancer becomes real. When this placement is conscious, it has access to something profound, the ability to bring emotional wisdom to a family line that may have only known emotional survival, to transform the inherited pain into genuine compassion, and to become not the one who holds everyone's burden, but the one who shows what it looks like to feel deeply and remain rooted in themselves at the same time. At its highest, Jupiter in Cancer teaches that true safety is not found outside of us, not in family, not in closeness, not in being needed. True safety begins in what I call the inner home, the place within you that can hold your own emotions without abandoning yourself, that can feel deeply without drowning, that can honor the past without being imprisoned by it. So when Jupiter in Cancer finds that inner home, then the emotional body becomes a source of wisdom rather than only a source of vulnerability. This placement becomes one of the most nourishing in the entire chart because it knows how to hold space, how to love without losing itself, how to protect without controlling, how to pass things forward that is not actually worth inheriting. This is the gift of Jupiter in Cancer at its full expression. Emotional abundance, not as a feeling that depends on others giving it to you, but as something you carry within yourself that you are then able to offer to the world. Jupiter in Leo. Jupiter in Leo is a fiery, expressive placement, and on the surface, it looks like one of the easier ones to understand. Jupiter expands, Leo shines, put them together, and you get someone with the biggest presence, natural confidence, and a desire to be seen. But the deeper story is more interesting than that and more honest. Jupiter in the placement of belief, faith, wisdom, and expansion, and Leo is ruled by the Sun, connected to the heart, identity, creative, and self expression, and the desire to be recognized for who they are. So when Jupiter is in Leo, the search for meaning becomes personal in a specific way. So the person grows through discovering who they are and having the courage to express it through creativity, through leadership, through the willingness to be visible when visibility feels vulnerable. And that last part is the key because Jupiter in Leo isn't just about confidence, it's about the relationship between confidence and the wound underneath it. So let's talk about the gifts first. At its best, Jupiter in Leo can produce someone with genuine warmth and generosity, someone who lifts the energy of the room, not by dominating, but by being fully present in it. There's often a natural desire to inspire others, to encourage people, to inspire people to believe in themselves, to remind people that life is not only about obligations and survival. There is joy here. There is heart. There is creative life force that can flow freely and can genuinely move people. This placement can do well in leadership and teaching and performance, as well as art and entrepreneurship, or any path where the person is allowed to create from their center and share it. And when what they're doing actually matters to them, Jupiter and Leo can be remarkable. But Jupiter expands whatever it touches. So the shadow side here is not hard to identify. It's hard to admit because it hides inside the confidence, it hides inside the strength, and it sounds like self-belief. But underneath the performance, there's often a wound asking a very quiet question: am I enough? So Jupiter in Leo can expand the need for recognition, the hunger for admiration, the belief that worth is confirmed by how many people are watching, approving, or applauding. And the more unconscious that belief is, the more the person performs, not for joy, but for the need to feel something that external validation can never actually fill. And this is the core shadow, not confidence. Confidence is the gift. The shadow is when confidence becomes a mask, when visibility it becomes the only way the person knows they exist, when pride becomes a wall against emotional truth because the ego cannot afford to be seen as anything less than radiant. And this is exactly where shadow work gets difficult for Jupiter and Leo because shadow work requires humility. It requires looking at the parts of yourself that is not so impressive, not polished, and it's not ready for the audience. And Leo, especially Leo with a wound, can resist that deeply. So let's bring in the sequence. The moon holds the emotional memory. And if the moon learned early that love and safety comes from being celebrated through being special, through being the one who lights up the room, then the nervous system begins to organize itself around visibility. It becomes sensitive to being overlooked. It reads the energy of the room for signs of approval or withdrawal, and it knows exactly when the warmth shifts. So Mercury interprets reality through that atmosphere. Being criticized starts to feel like humiliation, or being overlooked starts to feel like rejection. Any moment where the person is not being affirmed can register as a threat to their fundamental worth. So Venus forms the value system from there. Venus talents become valuable. Charisma becomes valuable. Being special, being creative, being admired. These things start to feel like the markers of love and belonging. And then Jupiter expands that belief. The belief might be, I matter when I'm seen. I grow when I'm recognized. My light has to be bright enough that no one can ignore it. Then Mars carries this belief into action, performing, leading, competing, pushing to be in the center, sometimes dominating the room, not from genuine confidence, but from the fear of what it would mean to be ordinary. And then Saturn crystallizes that result. The person may receive real recognition, real attention, real admiration, and still feel a loneliness underneath it, still feel unseen in a way that actually matters, still feel like the applause is for the performance and not for the person behind it. That is the pattern Jupiter in Leo has to see, because there is a difference between radiance and performance, and it matters because radiance comes from the heart. It expresses what is true. It gives light without needing anything back, and performance comes from the wound. It seeks confirmation. It's hungry even when the room is full. And the healing for Jupiter in Leo is not to dim the light. It's not to become smaller, self-effacing, or falsely modest. The healing is to find where the light is actually coming from and to move it from the ego back into the heart. Because Leo is ruled by the sun, and the sun doesn't compete. It doesn't need an audience to acknowledge it in order to keep shining. It simply is what it is. And Jupiter in Leo, in its highest, expands that quality, the ability to live from the authentic self without needing the world to confirm it. So, in shadow work, the question for Jupiter in Leo is honest and direct. Can I feel worthy when no one is clapping? Can I create something without needing to be impressive? Can I lead without needing to be admired? Can I let the inner child be seen, not the polished version, but the real one, and trust that that is still enough? Because that inner child is where the real healing begins. Leo is connected to joy and play and the innocent desire to be celebrated, but the inner child doesn't only need applause, it needs presence. It needs love that isn't conditional or performance. It needs to know that it's worthy even when it's not at its best. And when Jupiter in Leo turns the light inward, then it stops seeking outside what it needs to give itself. And the whole expression changes. The creativity becomes freer because it's no longer carrying the weight of proving worth. And leadership becomes more generous because it's no longer competing. The presence becomes genuinely magnetic because it's no longer performing. And this is what I mean when I say immature Jupiter in Leo wants to be the center of attention, but mature Jupiter in Leo becomes centered in itself. That is the shift, and it changes everything. At that point, this placement can become a real source of courage for other people, not because it demands to be seen, but because it models what it looks like to live from the heart without apology, to create because the soul wants to create, to lead because something genuinely needs to be said and done or built, and to shine not as a performance of worth, but as a natural expression of presence. And this is the highest expression of Jupiter in Leo, faith in the heart, the courage to be exactly who you are, and not the version of you that gets applause, but the version that is actually true. Jupiter in Virgo. Jupiter in Virgo is one of the placements where the tension between the planet and the sign tells you almost everything you need to know. Because Jupiter rules Pisces, the sign directly opposite Virgo. So when Jupiter is placed in Virgo, you have the big picture planet trying to work through the most detail-oriented sign of the zodiac. So Jupiter wants to expand and to trust and to leap towards meaning. And Virgo wants to analyze, refine, and research and to understand how something works before committing to it. Jupiter says, have faith. And Virgo says, show me the evidence. And that tension is not a problem, it's a teaching. Because what Jupiter in Virgo is here to learn is that faith doesn't only live in grand visions and mystical experiences. Sometimes faith lives in the daily practices, in the small details, in the small devotional steps we take, in showing up consistently to do the work, even when the results are slow and maybe even unnoticed. This is the gift of this placement when it's working well, because Jupiter in Virgo can take big ideas and make them useful. It can take wisdom and turn it into a method. It can take inspiration and bring it into the body, into the routine, into practical choices of daily life. And this is not a placement that wants to believe something beautiful and then leave it in the abstract. They want to live the truth. And that is actually a form of spiritual maturity that many Jupiter placements struggle to develop, because Virgo is ruled by Mercury. And there's also a capacity here for observation and discernment, the ability to notice the small patterns and to create the larger reality. And Jupiter expands that quality. So Jupiter in Virgo can become very skilled at seeing what needs healing and what needs refining, and what is out of alignment and why. So in healing work, teaching, research, any kind of practical service, this can be a real strength. But this is where we have to be honest, because Jupiter expands whatever it touches. And in Virgo, that includes perfectionism. The shadow of Jupiter in Virgo is subtle because it looks like virtue. It looks like humility and diligence, as well as the desire to improve. But underneath, there's often a belief running quietly in the background. I'm not quite ready yet. It's not perfect yet until I've fixed this, or not until I'm better, or not till I've earned it. And Jupiter, the planet that should be expanding abundance and growth, gets trapped behind the belief. So the person keeps improving, keeps refining, keeps serving, keeps working, and somehow never arrives at the feeling of being enough. This is the deeper wound, not the work ethic, not the discernment, the belief that worth is something that has to be earned through usefulness, through healing, and through becoming good enough. And because Jupiter expands that belief, the standard keeps moving, and there's always more to fix, always more to improve, always one more thing that needs to be addressed before the person allows themselves to simply receive. So this brings in the sequence with the moon. The moon holds the emotional memory. And if the moon learned that safety comes through being useful and through being organized, or through being needed, or being helpful, or through managing things carefully, then the nervous system learned that staying productive is what keeps things safe. And rest feels dangerous, expansion feels premature, and receiving feels unearned. So Mercury interprets reality through that atmosphere, and mistakes begin to feel like a failure. Disorder begins to feel threatening. Imperfection begins to feel like proof that something is wrong with the situation or with the self. So Venus forms the value system from here. Usefulness becomes deeply valuable. Competence becomes tied with worth. And service, skill, purity, productivity, these things start to feel like the basis for being loved and accepted. And then Jupiter expands the belief that becomes I grow by improving, I'm worthy when I'm useful, I receive when I've done enough to deserve it. So Mars acts from that belief, overworking, overserving, fixing, organizing, analyzing, constantly trying to make things better, not for joy, but for the quiet pressure of never quite meeting the internal standard. And then Saturn crystallizes the result, a life that is genuinely productive and skilled, but exhausting, capable, but not peaceful, useful to everyone else, but rarely able to receive for itself. And this is the pattern that Jupiter and Virgo has to see. It takes real honesty to see it because it is dressed in all the right qualities, in humility, in diligence, in the desire to be of service. These are not bad things. The shadow is when they become the condition for self-acceptance. In shadow work, Virgo is actually one of the more willing signs to do the inner work. It doesn't usually resist self-examination. It's willing to look at patterns, track behavior, notice what isn't working. And that willingness is an asset. So the shadow work question for Jupiter in Virgo is this: am I refining myself for genuine care or for shame? Am I healing because I want to become whole or because I believe something is fundamentally wrong with me and needs to be corrected before I'm allowed to be here fully? Because there is a difference between devotion and self-punishment, and Jupiter in Virgo can slip between the two without noticing. So the healing path is learning to bring the same discernment and care that Virgo naturally applies to everything else and turn it towards the self with compassion instead of criticism. To understand that the wound does not need to be fixed before it's worthy of love, and that healing is not a perfection project, and that self does not have to be fully integrated before grace is allowed to enter. And this is where Jupiter in Virgo becomes genuinely spiritual, not in spite of its practicality, but through it. Because Virgo understands something profound, that the sacred can be found in the ordinary and in daily routines and in the way we care for the body and the quality of attention we bring to small things and the consistency of showing up day after day to do the work of becoming more conscious. So this is not a lesser spirituality. This is one of the deepest forms of it. So at the highest, Jupiter in Virgo teaches that faith is not only belief in something greater. Faith is the willingness to show up every day. Faith is the small act of devotion. Faith is trusting the healing, that healing happens incrementally, not all at once, and that showing up for the process without demanding perfection from it is in itself the practice. So when Jupiter in Virgo learns to serve from wholeness rather than from the need to earn worth, the placement becomes genuinely powerful. Not because the person is flawless, but because they have learned how to bring truth into the details of everyday life. And that is exactly what the world needs more of. So now, Jupiter in Libra. Jupiter in Libra is where growth moves through the relational field. And that tells you something important right away, because it means this person's belief about life and what's possible, about what they deserve, are being shaped greatly by what happens between them and others. So Jupiter is the planet of belief, faith, wisdom, and expansion, and Libra is ruled by Venus, connected to relationships, values, harmony, beauty, justice, and the way we meet ourselves through others. So when Jupiter is placed here, the higher mind doesn't only develop through solitary study or philosophical exploration. It develops through dialogue, through partnerships, through learning how to truly see another person, and more importantly, how to be seen. So the gift of displacement is real. Jupiter in Libra can bring a genuine desire for fairness, a natural ability to hold multiple perspectives, and a strong instinct towards cooperation. This person may grow through partnerships, through love, through learning how to relate with depth and honesty. And they can see both sides of a situation when others have already chosen a side. They can bring wisdom into conflict and help people understand something larger than the disagreement in front of them. There's also a strong connection to beauty and value here, and not just aesthetically. Libra is always asking what something is worth, what love should look like, what fairness actually means, and Jupiter expands those questions into a worldview, a deep belief system around what relationships are supposed to be and what exchange they expect from that relationship. So, which brings us into the shadow, because Jupiter expands whatever it touches, and in Libra, that includes the need for approval. So the core wound of Jupiter in Libra is subtle because it looks like grace. It looks like keeping the peace. It looks like I'm easy to love. But underneath, there's often a belief that says, if this relationship is okay, I'm okay. If this person approves of me, I'm valuable. If we're in harmony, I'm safe. And when that belief is unconscious, the person keeps measuring their worth through the mirror of someone else's response. They compromise, not from genuine generosity, but from the fear of what happens if the peace breaks. So they smooth things over, not because everything is fine, but because a conflict feels like it costs them something they cannot afford to lose. So let's bring in the sequence. So the moon holds the emotional memory. And if the moon learned early that safety comes from being pleasing through agreements, through not making waves, through keeping others comfortable, then the nervous system organizes itself harmony as survival. And any sign of disapproval feels threatening. Any conflict feels like a potential loss of love. Then Mercury interprets reality through that atmosphere. Disagreement starts to feel like rejection, and another person's disappointment starts to feel like failure, and distance starts to feel like proof that something has gone wrong, usually with the self. So Venus forms the value system from there. Because Libra is ruled by Venus, this part carries extra weight for this placement. Being chosen becomes valuable. Being agreeable, being beautiful, being easy to love, these things start to feel like the foundation of worth. And then Jupiter expands the belief, and the belief becomes growth comes through relationship. I'm more when I'm in partnership. Peace is more important than truth. If I can keep the harmony, everything will be okay. So Mars then acts from the belief, avoiding confrontation, smoothing things over, suppressing what it actually feels in order to preserve the connection. And then Saturn crystallizes the result, a life that looks relationally graceful from the outside, but inside there's often a quiet resentment building, the feeling of giving more than they're actually receiving, or a sense of being loved for the version of the self that keeps everything balanced while the real self stays hidden. So this is the pattern Jupiter in Libra has to see. And relationships will keep showing it to them because Libra is the mirror. The people this person attracts, the dynamics that keep repeating, the conflicts that feel most charged, these are the places where the belief system is most visible because relationship reveals what we cannot see alone. It shows us where we are conscious and where we're projecting, where we're genuinely giving and where we're performing generosity to avoid the cost of honesty. So in shadow work, the question for Jupiter in Libra is direct. Am I compromising for love? Am I abandoning myself to avoid conflict? Am I seeking harmony or avoiding truth? Am I in this relationship because it is genuinely aligned or because I don't want to face what leaving would ask of me? These are not easy questions for Libra because Libra genuinely values connection. It values beliefs. It genuinely believes in the possibility of real partnership. And that belief is not incorrect. The shadow is when the belief becomes a condition for self-worth rather than a value held alongside self-worth. So Jupiter in Libra also has a tendency to idealize, to see the potential in another person and expand it into something larger than what is actually there. And the disappointment that follows when reality doesn't meet the ideal, and this can feel like a failure in love, when it is actually an invitation to see more clearly, to stop projecting what they wish were true and start seeing what is. So that discernment between real love and ideal love, between genuine harmony and performed peace, is part of the wisdom path here. Because at its highest, Jupiter in Libra teaches that relationships can be a genuine path of awakening, not because another person completes us, but because another person reveals us. They show us where we are still seeking validation outside of ourselves, where we still don't know our own value, where we've been performing instead of being present. And when Jupiter in Libra understands that, the whole orientation shifts. The person stops asking only, do they choose me? And starts asking, am I choosing myself in this connection? They stop asking, are we in harmony? And they start asking, is this harmony honest? That is the move from unconscious Libra to conscious Libra, from needing the mirror to define the self to using the mirror to understand the self, and from seeking peace at any cost to creating peace that includes truth. And when that shift happens, Jupiter in Libra becomes genuinely wise in the matters of love and relationship. And this doesn't happen because it avoids difficulty, but because it has learned to stay open-hearted without abandoning what is real. Let's look at Jupiter in Scorpio. Jupiter in Scorpio is one of the most powerful placements in the entire series, and also one of the most demanding because here, Jupiter's search for meaning doesn't happen on the surface, it happens in the depth. So, Jupiter is the planet of belief, faith, wisdom, and expansion, and Scorpio is a water sign connected to emotional truth, transformation, power, intimacy, and the shadow, as well as what lives beneath the visible. So when Jupiter is placed here, growth doesn't come through optimism, adventure, or philosophical studies. It comes through depth, through the willingness to look at what is hidden in the self, in others, in the dynamics playing out beneath the surface of life. So this person may not trust easy answers. They may not believe what is presented on the surface. They want to know what is really going on, the motive behind the action, the wound behind the behavior, the emotional truth behind the story. And that instinct, when it's directed inwards, is one of the most powerful tools in shadow work. So, Jupiter in Scorpio can produce someone with strong emotional intelligence, penetrating perception, and a genuine capacity for transformation. And this placement may be drawn to psychology, healing, trauma work, astrology, metaphysics, investigation, or anything that reveals the deeper architecture of the human experience, It grows through going deep, through crisis that strips away what isn't real, and through emotional truth that others would rather avoid. And because Jupiter expands whatever it touches in Scorpio, it can expand all of that. So the depth, the capacity for depth, for healing, for profound psychological awareness expands. But it also expands the shadow because the shadow of Jupiter is rooted in distrust. Not because the person is suspicious by nature, but because something in the emotional history taught them that being open is dangerous, that vulnerability is a liability. And if you show what you truly want, it can be used against you. And Jupiter expands that belief until it becomes a whole worldview, one where the default is to guard, to test, to investigate before trusting, to hold back until the emotional terrain is fully mapped. So let's bring in the sequence. So the moon holds emotional memory. And if the moon learned early that safety requires emotional control and that you have to detect danger before it arrives, and that openness leads to betrayal, and that being seen fully is a risk, then the nervous system organizes itself around protection. It becomes vigilant. It breeds energy constantly. It is looking for what might be hidden beneath what is being shown. Mercury interprets reality through that atmosphere, and openness starts to feel like risk. Trust starts to feel like naivety, and another person's behavior gets analyzed for hidden motives, not always because there is any, but because the nervous system is looking for them. So Venus forms the value system from here. Intensity becomes valuable. Loyalty under pressure becomes the test for real love. Emotional depth, devotion, and the proof of trust becomes the markers of worth because anything less doesn't feel real. And then Jupiter expands the belief. The belief becomes truth is always hidden. Real growth comes through transformation and crisis. So you have to go through the darkness to earn wisdom. Power comes from knowing what others don't. So Mars then acts on that belief, withholding, testing, investigating, protecting, being very strategic, moving with intensity instead of what it desires and away from what feels threatening. And then Saturn crystallizes the result. The person becomes genuinely powerful. perceptive, emotionally intelligent, capable of seeing what others miss, but they also find themselves in recurring patterns of power struggles, betrayal, and emotional intensity. Not because those experiences are being sought out, but because the belief system keeps reorganizing life around the expectation of them. So, this is the pattern Jupiter in Scorpio has to see. And it takes real courage because Scorpio's natural instinct is to look outward for the hidden truth, to investigate what others are doing, what their motives are, what they're concealing. And the deeper work is turning that same penetrating awareness inwards because there's a critical question at the center of that displacement. Am I seeing what is actually there, or am I projecting an old wound onto the present moment? And this is the shadow question for Jupiter in Scorpio. It matters more than almost any other question in this series because Scorpio's perceptions feels so certain. The gut senses, the reading of energy, the knowing, it feels like truth. But sometimes what feels like intuition is actually a wound looking for confirmation. This is really hard to catch because it does take really turning inwards and committing to seeing a side of yourself that you've never looked at before. So Jupiter in Scorpio has to ask, what part of me does not yet know how to feel safe? Am I seeking truth or am I searching for proof of something I already believe about how people behave? So the healing is not in becoming less perceptive. The gift of this placement is real. It's the emotional depth, the capacity to see beneath the surface, the willingness to go where others won't. The healing is in learning that vulnerability is not weakness and that trust, extended consciously, is not the same as naivety. Because Jupiter in Scorpio can sometimes believe that transformation only comes through crisis and that love has to be intense to be real, and that anything gentle or easy cannot be trusted. And while this placement has often been through real difficulty, shadow work asks whether the belief that life must be hard and people must be tested is wisdom or whether it is the wound speaking. When Jupiter in Scorpio turns its investigative intelligence inwards, when it begins tracking its own patterns the way it tracks everyone else's pattern, this placement becomes extraordinary. It can follow the emotional thread all the way back to the root. It can uncover what is driving the behavior. It can see the projection. It can name what has been buried. It can hold that truth without flinching. And that is the spiritual detection at its highest. Not uncovering darkness in others, but bringing consciousness to the place within the self where the darkness once lived. That is the highest. Jupiter in Scorpio teaches that real power is not control. Real power is the ability to face the truth within yourself and be changed by it. To let an old identity die, an old belief, an old wound, an old version of the self that was built around survival, and trust that something truer can emerge through that death. That is the death and rebirth Scorpio understands more than any other sign. And when Jupiter is here, the capacity for transformation becomes the path to wisdom, not despite the darkness, but through it. Jupiter in Sagittarius. Jupiter in Sagittarius is one of the strongest placements to have because Jupiter rules Sagittarius. This is Jupiter's own sign, and this means everything Jupiter naturally wants to do, expand, seek, believe, explore, teach, find meaning, it can do here without resistance. Sagittarius is a seeker. It wants to understand life from a larger perspective. It wants truth. It wants freedom. It wants to go beyond what it already knows. So when Jupiter is placed here, the desire for growth can be very strong through travel, through education, through spiritual studies, through philosophy, through any path that opens the mind beyond the familiar. So Jupiter in Sagittarius believe life opens when you follow truth. And that belief can produce someone genuinely inspiring, someone with real faith, real optimism, and a strong sense of purpose, as well as the ability to help others see beyond their own limitation. This is a placement that can make great teachers, guides, seekers, people who can carry a living belief that life is larger than any single experience. So, at its highest, this is exactly what this placement does. It expands consciousness, it keeps the mind open, it brings humor and perspective into difficult places, and it reminds people that there is always more to learn and more to understand and more to grow towards. But Jupiter expands whatever it touches, and in Sagittarius, its own sign, it can expand the shadow just as powerfully as it can expand the gift. And so the shadow here is spiritual bypassing. And I want to name it directly because this is one of the placements where it shows up naturally and more visibly because it doesn't feel like avoidance, it feels like evolution. Jupiter in Sagittarius can love spiritual ideas. They love wisdom and teaching and philosophy, as well as metaphysics and higher knowledge and the big picture. And those things are genuinely valuable. But shadow work is not only about the big picture, it requires going into the personal wound, the emotional details, the past, the triggers, the unconscious patterns, the part of the self that does not feel evolved or inspiring or wise, just hurt. And Jupiter in Sagittarius may resist this, not consciously, but there is a tendency to want to find the meaning quickly, to understand the lesson and move on, to say everything happened for a reason before fully witnessing what actually happened, to rise above the emotional material rather than enter it. And when that happens, Jupiter becomes bypassing instead of wisdom. Optimism becomes denial. Faith becomes a way to avoid feeling, and higher knowledge becomes a substitute for emotional honesty. So let's bring in the sequence. So the moon holds the emotional memory, and if the moon learned that safety comes through staying positive, through movement, through focusing on the future, then the nervous system learned that rising above pain is what keeps things safe. And sitting with heaviness feels like a threat. And restriction feels dangerous. Being anchored in the past feels like the opposite of freedom. And Mercury interprets reality through that atmosphere. Emotional heaviness starts to feel like limitation. Sadness starts to feel like something to escape. Questioning the belief starts to feel too risky because the belief system is what keeps the world feeling meaningful. Venus forms the value system here, and freedom becomes deeply valuable. Knowledge becomes valuable. Adventure, spiritual growth, inspiration, these things start to feel like the marker of a life well lived. And then Jupiter expands the belief. The belief becomes growth means more experience, more knowledge, more truth, more freedom, more seeking. And it keeps expanding outward and believing it will eventually arrive at wisdom. Mars then acts from the belief, moving quickly, leaving situations that feel restrictive, chasing the next experience, defending belief, pursuing the horizon before fully understanding what is being avoided. And then Saturn crystallizes the result, a life full of movement, knowledge, and inspiration, but not always rooted in emotional integration. Wise in theory, still avoiding the personal wounds, able to inspire others while struggling to sit in their own pain. And this is the pattern Jupiter in Sagittarius has to see because there is a specific version of that shadow that is worth naming, and that is self-righteousness. When Jupiter is in its own sign, the person can develop a strong conviction in their beliefs, a sense of being guided, a sense of knowing. And when that becomes my truth is the truth, then the open seeker becomes the certain teacher who no longer needs to learn, and wisdom calcifies into dogma. So real truth is alive. Real wisdom keeps opening. And the person who is genuinely growing becomes more spacious, more humble, more willing to be wrong, not less. So in shadow work, the question for Jupiter in Sagittarius is honesty. Am I seeking truth or am I avoiding pain? Am I expanding or am I escaping? Am I teaching something that I've actually embodied or something I only understand intellectually? Because understanding the truth is not the same as living it. Knowing a teaching is not the same as having been changed by it. And Jupiter in Sagittarius has to be willing to let the inner world become a landscape to explore, not only the outer one. The past is also a place where wisdom can be found. And the unconscious is also a frontier. And that seeker who turns that curiosity inwards, who brings the same courage and openness to their own emotional reality, and that they bring to philosophy and spiritual study. That is when the placement becomes genuinely powerful, because at that point, Jupiter's higher perspective serves the healing rather than bypassing it. So Sagittarius can step back and witness the pattern, ask what this experience is teaching, see the larger truth without using the larger truth to escape the personal one. And the freedom Jupiter in Sagittarius wants so deeply becomes something more mature. Immature Sagittarius believes freedom means no limits, no heaviness, no restriction. Mature Sagittarius understands that real freedom is inner freedom from unconscious beliefs, freedom from dogma, freedom from the wound that keeps running towards the next thing. That freedom only comes when the person can stay present with truth, even when truth is uncomfortable, when wisdom has become humbled by its own shadow and become larger because of it. That is embodied faith. That is the highest expression of Jupiter in Sagittarius. Not the person who has learned all the answers, but the person who has stayed open enough to keep learning from life, including from the parts of life that didn't look like expansion at all. Jupiter in Capricorn. So Jupiter in Capricorn is one of the more challenging placements for Jupiter. And understanding why tells you everything about what this person is here to learn. Jupiter is naturally expansive. It wants to believe, to grow, to leap towards possibility. And Capricorn is ruled by Saturn, the planet of structure, discipline, time, consequence. And when Jupiter is placed in Capricorn, the expansive energy of Jupiter has to move through Saturn's world. And Saturn doesn't move on faith alone. Saturn asks, what will this require? How long will it take? Can it be sustained? Jupiter says, what could this become? And Capricorn says, what will it cost? And are you prepared to pay? So this tension is not a flaw in the placement. It's the teaching. Because Jupiter in Capricorn is here to learn that real growth is not only inspiration, it's what you build with that inspiration over time. That can produce something genuinely powerful. This placement can take a vision and make it real. It can take faith and turn it into a plan. It can understand that success is not only about enthusiasm, it is about consistency, timing, and the willingness to keep going long after the initial excitement fades. And this person may not always appear optimistic on the surface. They may be cautious, realistic, skeptical of things that seem too easy. But once they commit to something, they have remarkable endurance. They know how to work with time. The gift at its highest is inner authority, leadership, a leadership that comes not from performance or status, but from genuine competence, integrity, and maturity earned through experience. So Jupiter in Capricorn can build things that last, career, system structure, legacy, because they understand that What is truly valuable takes time to develop, but Jupiter expands whatever it touches. And Capricorn, that includes the shadow side of Saturn and the fear that nothing comes without struggle, that you cannot trust what arrives easily, and that worth has to be proven through enough effort before it can be received. And this is the core wound of this placement. It runs deep because it feels like wisdom. It feels like realism. And underneath the practicality and the discipline, there's often a belief that life will not support you unless you carry it yourself. That rest is irresponsible and receiving is naive, and that the only thing worth having is the things you've worked hard enough to deserve. So let's look at the sequence. So the moon holds the emotional memory, and if the moon learned early that safety comes through control, through being prepared, through being responsible, through managing everything carefully, then the nervous system organizes itself around self-sufficiency. Dependence feels dangerous. Uncertainty feels threatening. And anything that cannot be planned or controlled registers as risk. So Mercury interprets reality through that atmosphere. Failure starts to feel like shame, rest starts to feel like irresponsibility, and ease starts to feel like suspicion. Because if something comes without struggle, how can it be real? So Venus forms the value system from here. Achievement becomes valuable. Competence becomes tied to worth. Status, discipline, productivity brings respect. And these things start to feel like the foundation of being enough. But then Jupiter expands the belief. The belief becomes growth comes through hard work, through proving yourself, through building something others can see and measure. I'm worthy when I succeed, when I'm safe, when I'm in control, and life will support me once I've earned it. So Mars then acts from that belief, overworking, overplanning, pushing through when the body is asking for rest, taking on more responsibility than one person should carry, suppressing vulnerability because vulnerability feels like weakness and weakness feels dangerous. And Saturn crystallizes the result. A life that looks capable and structured and respected from the outside, but inside there's often exhaustion, the feeling of carrying too much, success that doesn't satisfy the way it was supposed to, achievement that keeps raising the bar without bringing the peace that was promised. So this is the pattern Jupiter in Capricorn has to see, because the goal keeps moving. There's always more to prove, more to build, more to accomplish before the person allows themselves to feel like enough. And this is where shadow work becomes important but also where it presents a specific challenge for this placement. Because Jupiter in Capricorn may approach shadow work the way they approach everything else, with discipline, with a plan, with a method to do it correctly, to master the wounds, to become the emotional body through effort, to overcome the emotional body through effort. But healing is not mastery. Healing requires something Capricorn finds genuinely difficult: softening, receiving, allowing support, letting the inner authority become compassionate rather than demanding. The same nature and seriousness that is Capricorn's strength can become another way of being hard on themselves if it isn't brought into consciousness. So in shadow work, the question for Jupiter in Capricorn is direct. Am I building from purpose or from fear of failure? Am I being responsible, or am I carrying what was never mine to carry? Am I being realistic, or am I refusing to trust life? Am I pursuing this because it's genuinely aligned, or because I'm trying to prove I'm enough? Because worth is not created by achievement, it's not created by status or how much we can carry or how strong we appear. Real worth exists underneath all of that. And when Jupiter in Capricorn begins to feel that, not just understand it intellectually, but feel it in the body, the relationship to ambition shifts. The person still builds. They can still lead, they can still create something meaningful and lasting, but they're no longer building from a place of inner lack. They're building from inner authority, and that's completely different. Different kind of structure, one that is sustainable because it isn't being driven by the constant need to prove. And this is also where Jupiter and Capricorn can finally work together well, because Jupiter brings the vision and the faith, and Capricorn brings the structure and the patience to make it real. And faith without structure becomes fantasy. Structure without faith becomes limitation, but when they work together consciously, and Jupiter opens the possibility and Capricorn builds the path, this placement can create something genuinely powerful. So at its highest, Jupiter in Capricorn teaches that faith can be mature, quiet, disciplined, not loud or dramatic, but the steady decision to keep showing up, to build slowly, to trust that what is really meaningful will stand the test of time. And that is grounded faith. And that is one of the most durable forms of wisdom in the entire zodiac. Jupiter in Aquarius. Jupiter in Aquarius is where expansion happens through the mind, through vision, through innovation, through the willingness to see beyond what the collective currently accepts as possible. So Jupiter is a planet of belief, faith, wisdom, and expansion. And Aquarius is traditionally ruled by Saturn and its modern ruler, which is Uranus, which means it carries both structure and disruption. So it is connected to the future, the collective, the originality, rebellion, and the higher intelligence and the kind of thinking that breaks existing systems in order to build something more conscious. So when Jupiter is placed here, growth doesn't happen through tradition or emotional bonding or personal achievement. It happens through ideas that are ahead of their time. So this person may expand through groups, communities, social movements, technology, astrology, metaphysics, humanitarian work, or anything that contributes to how humanity evolves. They may have a large vision, not just for themselves, but for the collective. Not just what is good for me, but what is good for the whole. What helps us move forward. That quality, when it's conscious, is genuinely rare and genuinely needed. Jupiter in Aquarius can also produce someone with a strong sense of individual authenticity, a refusal to follow the crowd simply because the crowd is moving, a desire to question received beliefs from family, from culture, from society, and to choose what is actually true rather than what was handed down. And that questioning instinct is a gift, but Jupiter expands whatever it touches. And in Aquarius, that includes the tendency towards detachment. So this is the shadow of Jupiter in Aquarius. And it's subtle because detachment often looks like wisdom or objectivity or the higher perspective, the ability to observe without being swept away. It can be all of those things, but when detachment becomes the default response to anything emotionally demanding, it stops being clarity and starts being avoidance. So Jupiter in Aquarius can gradually build a belief where emotional distance is freedom, and where needing people feels like weakness, and where being vulnerable means losing objectivity, or where being different means being permanently separate. And when Jupiter expands that belief, the person becomes increasingly isolated because the belief keeps organizing their life around a kind of safety that feels like independence, but functions like loneliness. So let's bring this into the sequence. So the moon holds the emotional memory. And if the moon learns early that safety comes through distance, through not needing too much, through staying detached, through maintaining emotional space. Then the nervous system organizes itself around independence or protection. Closeness starts to feel like a threat to freedom, and emotional demands start to feel like confinement. So Mercury interprets reality through that atmosphere. Vulnerability starts to look like limitation, and tradition starts to look like imprisonment, and emotional heaviness starts to feel like something to rise above rather than move through. And then Venus forms the value system from here. Intellectual connections become more comfortable than emotional intimacy. Shared ideas become more valuable than shared vulnerability. And freedom and space becomes the condition for feeling safe in a relationship. And when Jupiter expands that belief, the belief becomes growth requires independence. Real connections happen through shared vision, not through emotional need. And in its highest expression, there's a real truth in that. But when the wound is running it, the belief keeps the person just far enough from real intimacy that they never have to risk being truly seen. So Mars then acts from that belief, distancing, disrupting, moving towards groups and causes, leaving situations that feel too restrictive or too emotionally demanding. And then Saturn crystallizes that result, a life full of ideas, community, and not always emotionally present, connected to humanity in the abstract, but sometimes disconnected from the person right in front of them. So this is the pattern Jupiter in Aquarius has to see. And it requires a specific kind of honesty because the detachment often genuinely feels like clarity. The distance feels like perspective. The question that cuts through is this: am I detached because I see clearly or because I don't want to feel? Am I free or am I avoiding intimacy? There's also a shadow worth naming here specifically, and that is the difference between rebellion and liberation. Because Jupiter in Aquarius can mistake rejecting the old thing for being free of it. But if the person is only doing the opposite of what once controlled them, then the old thing is still defining their movement. That is reaction, not freedom. So true freedom is being able to choose from consciousness, not just from the wound that wants to prove it won't be controlled by it. So the shadow question for Jupiter in Aquarius is this: is my rebellion conscious or is it reactive? Am I questioning this belief because I've genuinely examined it or because it represents what once constrained me? When that question is taken seriously, something shifts because Jupiter in Aquarius actually has a powerful capacity for self-witnessing, the ability to step back, observe patterns, and see the larger structure of what is happening. That is a genuine gift for shadow work. This placement can see collective conditioning clearly. It can recognize inherited belief systems, social programming, family patterns that were absorbed without being chosen. And it can help others see that too. But the healing path isn't only observing the pattern from above, it's feeling what the pattern was protecting, coming back into the body, allowing the emotional body to matter as much as the intellectual one, recognizing that awakening is not rising above the human experience, it's becoming more conscious within it. That's a big one. So at its highest, Jupiter in Aquarius teaches that true liberation is not disconnection. You can belong without losing yourself. You can be emotionally present without becoming consumed. You can be part of a collective without betraying your authenticity. That combination, freedom and genuine connection, vision and embodied presence, is the wisdom this placement is working towards. When Jupiter's in Aquarius gets there, the gift is real. not just original ideas, but the kind of thinking that actually changes how people see themselves and the world they live in. So Jupiter in Pisces. Jupiter in Pisces, in many ways, brings us full circle because Pisces is where the individual self begins to dissolve back into the larger field. And Jupiter, which rules Pisces traditionally, expands that dissolution. So Jupiter is the planet of faith, belief, wisdom, and expansion. And Pisces is the sign of the mystic, connected to the unseen, the unconscious, compassion, creativity, dreams, and the felt sense of that life is much larger than the physical world shows us. So when Jupiter is placed here, the search for meaning becomes deeply spiritual, not through logic or achievement or structure, but through surrender, through feeling, through the place where the personal self opens into something larger than itself. So this placement can produce someone with natural faith, a felt sense of being guided, spiritually held, connected to something beyond the ordinary mind. And they may receive through dreams, through intuition, through symbols, through the emotional field around them. They may feel what others feel without needing to explain it. So they can be drawn to healing, to art, to music, to poetry, prayers, meditation, very devotional, or anything on the path where the visible and the invisible world meets. And when this sensitivity is grounded, when it has boundaries, and when there's discernment, it becomes one of the most genuinely compassionate and spiritually wise placements in the chart. But Jupiter expands whatever it touches, and in Pisces, that includes the tendency to dissolve. So, the shadow of Jupiter in Pisces is not compassion. Compassion is the gift. The shadow is when compassion has no container. And when the person keeps pouring themselves out in the name of love, service, spiritual surrender, or without anything to hold the self in place. So Jupiter in Pisces can build a belief system where having no boundaries is spirituality, and where absorbing others' pain is compassion, and where forgiving everything, including things that actually need to be witnessed honestly, is the mark of an evolved soul, and where escaping into fantasy, into spiritual experiences, into the flow is the same thing as genuine transcendence. And when Jupiter expands that belief, the person can become genuinely depleted, giving and feeling more and more, absorbing more and more, until there's very little self left to orient from. So this brings in the sequence. So the moon holds the emotional body. And if the moon learned early that safety comes from disappearing, pleasing through merging, through not taking up much space, or through absorbing the emotional needs of others, then the nervous system learned that having no strong self is what keeps the peace. Boundaries start to feel like cruelty. So personal needs start to feel like selfishness, and surrender starts to feel like the only spiritual option. Mercury interprets reality through that atmosphere, and clarity starts to feel harsh. Confrontation starts to feel like spiritual failure, or saying no starts to feel like an act of separation rather than an act of integrity. Then Venus forms the value system from there. Unconditional love becomes the ideal, not as a genuine spiritual value, but as a wound, and sacrifice becomes connected to worth. Spiritual devotion and compassion becomes the marker for being lovable, being good, being safe. And when Jupiter expands the belief becomes growth comes through surrender, through service, through dissolving the ego, through forgiving everything, through giving more than I receive. And there is real spiritual truth in parts of that. But when the wound is running, surrender becomes avoidance, and forgiveness becomes a way to skip witnessing the pain, and service becomes self-erasure. So Mars then acts from the belief, rescuing, overgiving, avoiding confronting, dissolving into others' needs, escaping into fantasy or spiritual experiences when reality becomes too demanding. And then Saturn crystallizes the result, a life that looks spiritually generous and compassionate, but underneath there's depletion, confusion about where the self ends and others begin, an inspiration that never quite lands into form, and forgiveness extended before the wound has actually been witnessed. This is the pattern Jupiter in Pisces has to see. And the specific shadow work question for this placement is one of the most important in the series. Am I surrendering or am I avoiding? Am I forgiving or am I denying my own pain? Am I helping from love or from guilt or from the belief that my worth depends on being needed? Because Pisces has genuine access to the unconscious, to what is unspoken, and to the collective emotional field. And Jupiter expands that access. So this person may feel what is hidden in a room before everyone speaks. They may absorb grief that isn't theirs. They may sense past life impressions and ancestral sorrow without always being able to separate it from their own experiences. And that is a profound gift, but without grounding, it becomes overwhelming. And that is the teaching. Grounding doesn't block spirit. Grounding gives spirit a place to land. Boundaries don't block love. Boundaries give love a healthy channel. Discernment doesn't block compassion. Discernment protects compassion from becoming depletion. So Jupiter in Pisces has to learn that spiritual growth is not the dissolution of the self. It is the development of a self that is conscious enough to become a clear vessel. You can't offer what you don't have, and you can't give from a place of genuine fullness if you have emptied yourself before you've had anything real to offer. So this is also where the distinction between escape and surrender becomes essential, because they can look identical from the outside and they can feel similar from the inside. Both involve letting go, both involve releasing control, but escape moves away from truth and surrender moves towards it. Escape is what happens when the wound is still running the spiritual practice. Surrender is what happens when the self is grounded enough to genuinely release. So when Jupiter in Pisces understands that distinction, when it can stay present in the body while opening to the larger field, this placement becomes something rare. Not just spiritually sensitive, but spiritually grounded. Not just compassionate, but clear. Not just creative, but able to bring that creativity into form. At its highest, Jupiter in Pisces teaches that faith is not only floating in the unseen, faith is also trusting the soul enough to be fully present in the human experience and to bring the divine into daily life, into the body, into the wound, into the healing process itself, to stay open without dissolving, to love without abandoning the self, to surrender not because you have no other choice, but because you're conscious enough to choose it. That is embodied faith. And that is the highest expression of this placement. So as you reflect on your Jupiter sign, don't only ask, where are you lucky? Also ask what you believe. Ask what you're expanding. Ask what you keep reaching for and whether that desire is coming from truth, wisdom, or an old wound that still wants to be witnessed. Because Jupiter does not only show where life gives us more, Jupiter shows us where we're asked to grow into a larger, wiser, and more conscious version of ourselves. So thank you for joining me. I hope this resonated with you. You're welcome to subscribe, hype, like, share. All of this helps my channel to grow. And also, I want to remind you that every week I offer a free shadow work circle at 7 p.m. Eastern, which is 4 p.m. Pacific. And also, I do offer natal chart readings, one-on-one shadow work if you'd like a more personal approach. You can find everything on my website at starwellastro.com. So, thank you for joining me. Thank you.